There is a moment in every love story when silence becomes louder than words. A moment when two hearts still love each other, but neither knows how to cross the distance that separates them. Tonight, you are about to witness that moment. Don't skip. Because every second of this story hides a truth that changes everything. Listen carefully. No one in the house realized what had happened that evening. The lights were still on, dinner was still warm on the table, and conversations continued as if nothing had changed. But inside one quiet room, someone sat completely still, staring at a single photograph they had promised themselves they would never look at again. It was an old picture, slightly folded at the edges, carrying memories that refused to fade no matter how much time had passed. The person holding that photograph was your soulmate. For months they had convinced themselves that walking away had been the only choice. They repeated that lie every morning, every afternoon, and every night until even they almost believed it. Yet every time the world became quiet, your name returned like a whisper that refused to disappear. They remembered the conversations that ended too soon, the words they never said, the apologies trapped inside their heart, and the dreams that were abandoned before they had the chance to become reality. The strange part was not that they still remembered you. The strange part was that every memory felt more alive now than it ever had before. Outside, the rain began to fall gently against the window. Your soulmate stood up and walked toward the glass, watching tiny drops race down into the darkness. They closed their eyes for only a moment, but in that moment they could almost hear your voice again. Not because you were there, but because regret has a way of making memories sound real. They whispered quietly, "If I lose them one more time, I don't think I'll ever forgive myself." No one heard those words. They were never meant for anyone else. They were spoken only to the silence. Yet the silence gave no answer. Instead, another memory appeared. It was the day everything changed. The misunderstanding. The pride. The people who spoke when they should have remained silent. The family members who thought they knew what was best. The friends who carried half-truths instead of honesty. Piece by piece, walls were built between two hearts that had once believed nothing could separate them. And eventually, both of you walked away in opposite directions, each believing the other had stopped caring. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Life continued, but happiness never returned in the way either of you expected. Your soulmate smiled when necessary, laughed when people were watching, and answered every question with the same simple phrase. "I'm fine." But deep inside, they carried a weight no one else could see. Every celebration reminded them of someone missing. Every quiet evening reminded them of unfinished conversations. Every sunrise became another chance to pretend they had moved on. Yet pretending and healing are never the same thing. The heart always knows the difference. Don't skip. Because this was only the beginning. Late that night, after everyone had gone to sleep, your soulmate opened an old wooden drawer they hadn't touched for a very long time. Inside were forgotten memories. A dried flower pressed between notebook pages, a ticket from a place both of you once visited, a tiny handwritten note whose ink had started to fade. Their hands trembled as they picked up the note. They remembered every word before reading it because some memories never leave. They smiled for only a second before tears quietly filled their eyes. It wasn't simply because they missed you. It was because they finally understood something they had ignored for far too long. Love had never disappeared. Fear had simply spoken louder than love. Pride had spoken louder than honesty. And silence had spoken louder than both of your hearts. For the first time since everything fell apart, they made a decision they never thought they would make again. They reached for their phone. Your name was still there. The conversation had not been deleted. Hundreds of empty days sat between the last message and tonight. Their thumb hovered above the screen. One message. Just one message. Could change everything. But what if you never replied? What if you had already forgotten them? What if someone else now occupied the place they once held inside your heart? Those questions froze them in place. Minutes passed without movement. Finally, they locked the phone again and placed it back onto the table. I've already lost them once, they whispered. I can't survive losing them again. Just then, there was a soft knock at the bedroom door. Your soulmate quickly wiped away every tear before answering. The voice from outside said only one sentence. There's someone downstairs asking about you. And they mentioned a name you haven't heard in a very long time. The room fell completely silent. Your soulmate stood frozen beside the door, unable to breathe for a moment. Their heart pounded so loudly that it almost drowned out every other sound in the house. They looked at the handle, then back toward the phone resting on the table, as though time itself had stopped and was waiting for one single decision. Slowly, they opened the bedroom door. Standing outside was an older family member whose expression carried a mixture of concern and disbelief. They spoke quietly, almost as if they were afraid the walls might overhear. Someone came here a few minutes ago. They didn't stay long. They only asked one question. Is it finally too late to tell the truth? Your soulmate frowned immediately. Who was it? They asked. But the answer was unexpected. They refused to tell us their name. They simply left this envelope and walked away. The envelope was plain, slightly worn at the edges, with no address, no stamp, and no return name. Only two handwritten words appeared across the front. Those words were your name. The moment your soulmate saw those letters, their hands began to shake uncontrollably. They had imagined hearing your name 1,000 times in their mind, but seeing it written before them felt completely different. It felt real. It felt impossible. It felt like fate had suddenly interrupted a story everyone believed had already ended. They carried the envelope back into their room without saying another word. The door closed gently behind them. For several minutes they simply stared at it without opening it. Fear is a strange thing. Sometimes we fear bad news. Sometimes we fear good news even more, because hope can be terrifying after disappointment. Your soulmate whispered to themselves, "What if this changes everything?" Finally, with trembling fingers, they unfolded the letter inside. It was only 1 page long, yet every sentence felt heavier than the last. The first line immediately stole the air from their lungs. The person you blamed was never the one who walked away. They blinked several times, reading it again to make sure they hadn't misunderstood. The next sentence hit even harder. Someone made sure both of you believed the other had given up. Your soulmate slowly sat down on the edge of the bed. Memories they had buried for so long suddenly began connecting like pieces of a puzzle. Conversations that never made sense. Messages that mysteriously stopped. Invitations that somehow never arrived. Excuses that sounded believable at the time. One by one, every forgotten moment returned with painful clarity. They continued reading. The letter never mentioned who had written it, but it described events only a handful of people could possibly know. It explained that during the days when both of you desperately wanted to speak, someone else had been speaking for both of you instead. Messages had been delayed. Truth had been hidden. Lies had quietly replaced honesty until neither of you knew what to believe anymore. Every misunderstanding had been carefully encouraged by someone who benefited from keeping the two of you apart. Your soulmate closed their eyes, overwhelmed by a realization that felt almost unbearable. What if none of this was ever your fault? They whispered into the silence. The question echoed through the room, and for the first time in months, anger replaced regret. Not anger toward you, but toward the invisible hands that had quietly shaped both of your lives without either of you realizing it. Don't skip. Because the truth had only revealed its first layer. Across town, at almost the exact same moment, another story was unfolding. You had no idea that your name had just appeared inside that mysterious envelope. You had spent countless nights convincing yourself that the chapter was over. Friends had told you to move on. Family had encouraged you to stop looking back. Yet every once in a while, without warning, something would remind you of a promise that had never truly been broken inside your heart. That evening, while organizing old belongings, you found something hidden inside the pages of a forgotten notebook. It was a small folded receipt from years ago. Most people would have thrown it away immediately, but on the back was a handwritten sentence you didn't even remember writing. If we ever lose each other, promise me we'll search for the truth before believing the silence. You stared at those words for a long time. They suddenly felt less like a memory, and more like a warning that neither of you had followed. Back in the bedroom, your soulmate reached the final paragraph of the anonymous letter. It read, "You still have one chance. But not much time. Someone close to both of you is preparing to leave forever, carrying the full truth with them. If that happens, the secret separating you may never be uncovered." Your soulmate's heartbeat quickened again. Leave forever? Who could that possibly be? They quickly turned the page over, hoping for another clue, but it was blank. There was nothing else except one small symbol drawn in the corner, a symbol they recognized immediately. It was connected to a place both of you had visited together years ago, a place filled with memories neither of you had ever forgotten. That couldn't be a coincidence. Whoever had written the letter wanted them to go there. Without wasting another second, your soulmate grabbed their keys, slipped the envelope into their jacket, and quietly left the house before sunrise. The streets were almost empty. The morning air was cold, but they barely noticed. Every mile brought another question. Every question brought another memory. Every memory whispered the same painful possibility. Maybe love had never failed at all. Maybe the truth had simply arrived too late. As the first rays of sunlight touched the horizon, your soulmate finally reached the old place marked by the symbol in the letter. It looked almost exactly the same as before, except for one unexpected detail. Someone was already waiting there. And in their hands was a second envelope with your name written across the front. Your soulmate stopped walking. The morning breeze moved quietly through the empty place, but everything else felt completely still. The stranger waiting there never spoke immediately. Instead, they looked carefully at your soulmate, as though trying to decide whether the truth had arrived too late. Seconds passed without a single word. Finally, the stranger held out the second envelope and said softly, "I was beginning to think you wouldn't come." Your soulmate accepted it with trembling hands, their eyes fixed on the familiar handwriting. It looked almost identical to the first envelope, yet something about this one felt even heavier. Before opening it, they asked the question that had been growing inside their heart all night. "Who are you?" The stranger gave only a faint smile. "My name isn't important. What matters is that I stayed silent for far too long. And silence has already stolen enough years from both of you." Those words struck harder than expected. They weren't spoken with anger. They were spoken with regret, the kind of regret carried by someone who had watched lives fall apart while believing that remaining quiet was somehow the safest choice. Slowly, your soulmate unfolded the letter. The first sentence made them catch their breath. Neither of you stopped loving each other. You were simply separated by a lie that became stronger every day it was left unchallenged. They continued reading, and every paragraph uncovered another piece of the hidden story. Long ago, when both of you were desperately trying to reconnect, someone close to the family had intercepted important conversations. Messages had mysteriously disappeared. Phone calls had gone unanswered, not because either of you ignored them, but because they never reached the person they were meant for. Every misunderstanding created another wall. Every unanswered message became another reason to give up. Eventually, both hearts believed the same painful lie. That the other person had chosen to walk away forever. It wasn't one dramatic betrayal that separated you. It was hundreds of tiny deceptions, each one almost invisible on its own, but together powerful enough to rewrite an entire future. Your soulmate lowered the letter, unable to stop the memories flooding back. They remembered nights when they waited for a reply that never came. They remembered birthdays spent staring at a silent phone. They remembered hearing from others that you had already moved on, even though no proof had ever existed. At the time, believing those words had seemed easier than holding on to hope. Now every one of those memories looked completely different. The pain had been real. But the story behind it had been false. Tears quietly filled their eyes as they whispered, "I should have searched for the truth. I should have trusted what my heart kept trying to tell me." The stranger nodded gently. Both of you wanted answers. But when enough people repeat the same lie, even honest hearts begin to doubt themselves. Don't skip. Because the biggest revelation had not yet been spoken. The stranger reached into their bag and carefully removed a small recorder. It looked old, almost forgotten by time. "There's one more thing you need to hear," they said. "I kept this because I couldn't bring myself to destroy it. But I also didn't have the courage to reveal it until today." Your soulmate hesitated before pressing the play button. At first there was only static. Then familiar voices slowly emerged. Conversations from years ago. Names they recognized instantly. One voice calmly admitted, "As long as they believe each other gave up, they'll never come back together." Another voice answered, "Exactly. If the truth comes out, everything we've planned will fall apart." Your soulmate's hands began shaking so violently they almost dropped the recorder. Those weren't strangers speaking. Those were people they had trusted without question. People who had smiled at family gatherings, offered advice, and pretended to care while quietly pushing two lives further apart. Every sentence on the recording shattered another illusion. The people involved had convinced themselves they were protecting everyone from future pain. Instead, they had created years of unnecessary heartbreak. No one had expected the consequences to last this long. No one imagined that two people would continue carrying silent love instead of replacing it with resentment. The stranger quietly turned off the recording. "I can't change what happened," they said. "But I refuse to let the truth disappear with me." Your soulmate looked toward the horizon, struggling to steady their breathing. For the first time in years, they no longer felt trapped by unanswered questions. Now they knew exactly what had happened. But another question immediately replaced all the others. Where are they now? The stranger looked down for a moment before answering. Closer than you think. But farther than you realize. Confused, your soulmate frowned. "What does that mean?" The stranger sighed deeply. "For a long time, your paths kept missing each other by only a few minutes. You visited places after they had already left. They searched for answers after you had stopped looking. You were never as far apart as either of you believed. Fate kept bringing you close. But fear always arrived first." Those words were almost impossible to accept. How many times had both of you unknowingly stood in the same city? walked the same streets, sat in the same places, wondered the exact same things. The thought alone was heartbreaking. Just as your soulmate was about to ask another question, the stranger handed over one final item. It wasn't a letter. It wasn't another recording. It was a small photograph taken only 3 days earlier. The moment your soulmate saw the picture, every color disappeared from their face. Because standing in the photograph was you. And written across the back, in unmistakable handwriting, were 7 words that changed everything. I still haven't stopped waiting for you. Final. Your soulmate stared at the photograph as though the entire world had stopped moving. For a long moment, they couldn't speak. Their fingers traced the edges of the picture, afraid that if they blinked, it might disappear like every other hope they had carried for so many years. On the back, those 7 words remained unchanged. I still haven't stopped waiting for you. They read them once. Then again. Then a third time. Every time the sentence felt more real. Every time it broke another wall they had built around their heart. The stranger quietly stepped back and said, "Some truths don't arrive when we're ready. They arrive when we're finally willing to hear them." Without another question, your soulmate left that place. There was no anger left, no pride left, and no desire to prove who had been right or wrong. None of that mattered anymore. All they wanted was one honest conversation, the conversation both of you had been denied for far too long. The road ahead felt uncertain, but for the first time in years, uncertainty no longer frightened them. Regret frightened them far more. They had already lost you once. They refused to lose you again because of silence. At the same time, you found yourself standing outside, looking toward the evening sky without knowing why your heart suddenly felt different. Some memories never truly leave us. They simply wait for the moment when hope becomes stronger than fear. You remembered promises you thought were forgotten. You remembered laughter that still echoed in quiet moments. Most of all, you remembered how love had never ended with hatred, it had only been buried beneath unanswered questions. Don't skip. Because every ending creates the beginning of another story. As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the horizon, 2 separate journeys quietly moved toward the same destination. Neither of you knew exactly what would happen next. Perhaps there would be tears. Perhaps apologies. Perhaps long moments of silence before the first words were spoken. But this time, silence would no longer separate 2 hearts. It would simply become the space before the truth was finally heard. When your soulmate finally reached the place where fate had pointed them, they stopped just a few steps away. Across the path stood a familiar figure. It was you. For several seconds, neither of you moved. Years of misunderstanding, unanswered messages, hidden lies, and quiet heartbreak stood between you like invisible walls. Then, without speaking, your soulmate took one slow step forward. "So. It was never you," they whispered. You looked into their eyes and answered with the same honesty you had carried all along. It was never you either. No dramatic speeches followed. No perfect words suddenly erased the past. Instead, there was something far more powerful: understanding. Both of you finally realized that love had not failed. Trust had been manipulated. Silence had been weaponized. But the truth, even though it arrived late, was finally strong enough to break every lie. As the night settled in, your soulmate gently smiled through tears and made one final promise.